Hello. Our first speaker of the day, and the first speaker of the first conference of Frontrow, will be from Opera Software, talking about the past, the present, and the future web. Patrick Lauke.
Right, well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Poland, let alone Krakow. So thank you to the organising committee for inviting me. Yeah, I want to, for this keynote, I'd like to, rather than show you in-depth code and things like that, which you will get enough of in the next 2 days, I thought I'd have a little look back at the web, as I'm an old timer of the web. A look at some of the old stuff that we used to do, and a little bit of philosophy that I try to draw out of my experiences of working on the web for a while. So, the once and future web. So, the web is exciting. Thank you very much. No, that's, you're all here. We're getting loads of new technologies, new techniques that we're working on now. All the HTML5 stuff is getting really exciting. It's a really exciting time to do web development. But as we're going through the various new technologies and everything else, for those of us who've been on the web for quite a while, there's certain patterns that I see kind of re-emerging over and over again. The same kind of discussions that developers are having. Okay, that's okay. You can hear me. I'm not the wisest of speakers anyway. So there's these patterns that I keep seeing, discussions that keep happening again and again between developers, and I hopefully kind of draw attention to some of them in this presentation. So I want to take you back to what I refer to as the good old days of web development. Don't worry, I'm not going to have an exhaustive history of the web, but this is the web as it was first built, as it was first envisaged, when Tim Berners-Lee created the first web server at CERN. Beautiful resource, mainly text. So that was the idea, that's how the web started. It's a resource to put up text, mainly kind of scientific documents. So you had the markup language that was created for that, was adequate for that particular purpose. So you had tags to define paragraphs, lists, links, etc. That was the kind of idea behind the web. It's actually interesting, I'll have the links to these resources later on in the slides as well. It's interesting reading through some of these early documents of this is the web. They're full of spelling mistakes, which is really great. And you start looking at these historic documents and they get simple words wrong. But it talks a lot about, in one of the design documents, about how the language of the web was really created just to mark up the meaning of things rather than the presentation. And already there, we're talking 1990, don't ask me, very early 90s, it's talking about some people want to create kind of layouts and everything else, and they've complained that HTML doesn't give them that ability, but we believe that we want to have a language that's pure. It's not about the presentation, it's about the content. So that was the idea, a very, very valiant idea that was kind of pushed through, even at the very early stages of the web. And then, again, don't worry, I'm not going to go through every single browser that we've had since then. Browsers like Mosaic came along, and as a big innovation, they now allowed images to be embedded inside web pages. Before, when you had an image, you could just link to it, it would open up in a separate kind of viewer, because the web was really about the text. All of a sudden, you could start doing things like embedding images into web pages, and that's where it all went wrong. No, not really. People wanted to put stuff on the web. Clearly, even in the early stages, they wanted to put stuff on the web that had a certain kind of presentational aspect to it, not just pure text. So you now start putting images in. Netscape, I believe, introduced the font element. All of a sudden, you could actually style up your text. Yes, it was pure text, but you could actually use some of the different fonts rather than the horrible kind of defaults that you get. I still wonder who decided that Times New Roman, even in today's browsers, should be the defaults. They should be shot. But you got these things, you started to get more and more kind of presentational stuff being grafted on top of HTML. And that's mainly because people, well, web developers, web designers, wanted to do this sort of stuff. They didn't buy in fully into the idea of this is just purely about some agnostic content. We want to actually start to make our pages look better, style them better, have some kind of design element to our content. And then you can chuckle at the kind of the very retro look of it, but this is when designers started to do the web series. That's probably around the time where I kind of embarked on this journey on the web, designing web pages kind of in the mid to late 90s. This is the sort of design that you saw. As I said, the look itself is very dated, but what designers used to do back then, and you can argue that they didn't understand the medium at the time, but what they did is they created beautiful layered designs in Photoshop, as they would do for their kind of print days. And then in this particular example, it's a big image, and then just loads of image area, image map kind of region. So you could actually click on things and jump to another page, which was exactly the same thing. One big image, all the text basically inside the image itself, not really using the web as it was meant to be, but using it as a design tool and just basically putting their designs in there. And then tables, yeah, beautiful. We have tables, the table markup, where you can create, as per standard, you can put data into your web pages, tabular data, stuff that you can put in, say, an Excel document. Designers got hold of that and started kind of using it and abusing it to actually do layouts, the way they were used to do in their desktop publishing systems, where you define your grids and you start pouring your content in. And really it became an art form. And I remember back in the days, I was priding myself on being really good at taking big images, spending hours slicing them up into loads of separate little images, building a very complex table and a nested table of tables, all just to basically create a design. It's a step up from one big image and an image map behind it, because these sort of designs, they allowed for a little bit of scalability. If you had more content, you could actually have your content as real text, but you spend a lot of time building these really monstrous heaps of markup to create basically a layout. And you could argue, and I will argue, that it was technology abuse, because that was not the idea of, in that case, the table markup, or the idea of all our web pages will be one big image and we'll put loads of image map areas on there. But the truth is, designers did use it. They did abuse the technology because they had a certain need and they wanted to express it on the web. The street finds its own uses for things, and that's exactly what happened there. Designers come along, they see HTML is very limited, and they started to take whatever they could and started to bend it, the purpose that it had, to actually do what they wanted to do, because they wanted to express themselves on the web. And yes, we had, even back then, already accessibility concerns. We'll hear the next talk will focus more on the accessibility side of things. But even back then, when you had designers started to abuse tables, abuse images, there was big outcry about, well, where's this going? Is it going to be accessible? And over time, we developed strategies and techniques to make, say, table-based layouts more accessible. Images, okay, put an alt attribute behind it, make sure that there is sensible information there. Also, of course, like search engines, they need to be able to get at your content. All those discussions were had, but this was very early on, this was a big fight between basically designers and people who believed in the web needs to be about the content. It's not a presentational tool as such. And yes, fast forward a little bit, we know this man with a blue beanie. Jake knows him very well. So designing with web standards. So the idea that, again, around 2000 or so, we all started to see, okay, there is a better way to build pages. After all the years and years we spent slicing images, putting them in tables, and really abusing the technology, because the technology wasn't ready yet, the technology wasn't there. We started to get better technologies available to us. So using CSS to at that stage, not create entire layouts because most of the browsers didn't really support it 100%. It was still very flaky. But you could start using CSS for simple things like don't use font elements anymore, font tags, and you could start doing basic kind of stuff with CSS. And as browsers evolved and the techniques became more robust, yes, we started to actually do entire layouts in CSS and everything else. But there was a transitional phase, I remember, back in those days, back in 2000, 2001, where even in the first edition of Designing with Web Standards, the big JZ, as we like to call him, actually advocates, okay, you can't maybe always do layouts with pure CSS because your users will use IE5 or something like that, which can't support it properly. Use an in-between technique. You could use a simple table. Don't triple nest your tables. Use a simple table, and then everything on top of that, you could start to gently use a little bit of CSS. The technology was slowly catching up. We weren't quite there yet. It wasn't an overnight, right, now we can use CSS layouts. There was a transitional period, but bit by bit, we got to the point where we could actually start using CSS for layout and abandon kind of the technology abuses that we had in the past. Big debates even back then. There were still designers that obviously built a career out of being really skilled and really good at slicing up images, putting them in tables, devising really complex table layouts with spacer GIFs everywhere, working out the percentages, how they should do, so the page scales. So obviously they were quite skeptical about, we can't use this newfangled technology. It's all, it's too cool. Who's going to use it? We should stick with tables. So there was always a little bit of a debate. And this sort of thing is one of these trends that I talked about that seem to be always recurring. Whenever a new technology comes along, there is a transitional phase until it's actually ready to be used properly. In the case of CSS, until the browser starts supporting it fully. And the people who are using the old technologies fight and they have big discussions about my old way is better than your new way because it's better supported. This is kind of history repeating itself over and over again. That's just an example from back in those days. And yes, as the technology evolved, we saw, and as more and more designers jumped on and started to use CSS properly, rather than just people who were really good at the technology, which is always the problem. People like, say, Eric Meyer, brilliant at CSS, but not a designer. So examples that they showed, look, here's the stuff we can do with CSS, didn't really excite anybody who was doing the old school kind of big table layouts until designers started to actually use the new technologies and started to explore what can be done. And then examples like the CSS Zen Garden here behind me, that's one of the early things that I did back in the days, just using similar techniques to slicing up images but actually using CSS to do it. That's when it started to become more of an accepted use. Designers realized, okay, looking beyond the technology itself, I can actually use that for my purposes. And they did. Nowadays, even though I still come across every now and again a few table-based designs which horrify me, nowadays it's pretty much accepted as best practice that we use CSS for our layouts and stuff. But it took a transitional period of time until we could. And as CSS started to become more and more used, there were still many things that you couldn't really do with CSS. CSS back in, say, 2003, 2004, again, I refer to that as my golden era of CSS. It was really exciting because CSS itself at the time, it gave us a lot of good things. You could define basic layouts, you could define your fonts and everything else. But there were still many cases that designers wanted to do something, but the spec itself wasn't actually quite ready. It wasn't catering to that particular use case. So we had loads of really, really clever people that really thought hard about how can we, again, slightly pervert or abuse technologies that we have available right now to do what they can't do just yet. And back in the days when a list apart was interesting, you had, controversial, it's not being recorded, is it? No. You had really clever techniques come along. Things like, who remembers sliding doors? So really where you started to think, okay, how can we use the very limited tools that we have available with our CSS to actually start to do more than what they were designed to do. 2 elements, 2 backgrounds, one is slightly bigger, and as the kind of content expands, we can have kind of rounded corners and everything else. Or, you know, the really, really convoluted ways in which we had to create, if we wanted to, or if our boss wanted to, create rounded corners around boxes that had varying amounts of content. And you really saw designers thinking really hard, okay, I need 4 elements so I can position all my 4 corners. And they started to almost pervert again the markup, even though we talk about form versus function, you should have semantic markup and then do the CSS. They really kind of bent over backwards to justify that we need this sort of markup because that makes sense, but really all that said was, because that gives me 4 elements, and I can start with margins and padding and everything else, I can create my corners. Very convoluted, but again, that's the idea. The spec itself, CSS, didn't give us the way to actually do it, so designers find their own ways of dealing with it and to express themselves. Faux columns, another one. Put a big background behind it, fake the kind of columns when you've got, say, 2 floated blocks. All of those techniques, it was really exciting because it looked like almost every week somebody came up with some new, cool, crazy technique of doing something that CSS itself wasn't designed to do. And I remember I kind of contributed a few things back in the days as well. It was really cool trying to find really bizarre uses for certain CSS things that actually had an effect that people wanted to use in their pages. Because my contention is the web itself, because of what we've seen, it thrives on hacks. The web, the technologies that underlie the web are never perfect, as we've seen with CSS. There is always some use case behind it that the spec doesn't cover, but designers and developers are clever, they want to do something and they'll find a way, very hacky sometimes, but they'll find a way to actually express themselves on the web, be it with, you know, rounded corners, multiple elements, etc. And there is always this tension, even today, as I said, this is a recurring theme, between what designers want to do, as we saw right at the very start with the images and image maps, and what the technology allows. That is basically true all the time, even today, with all the cool new stuff that's coming with HTML5, as we'll see in a moment. Who remembers the big debates back in those days about 800 by 600 or 640 by 480? I remember, you know, obviously the designers were always the ones with the big monitor at the agency or whatever. Everybody else had the small PCs or whatever. The designers had their Mac running 800 by 600. And they always argued, and the discussions online on mailing lists everywhere about, I looked at stat counter or whatever the equivalent was back then. There's only so many people using 640 by 480. When can I start to make my design 600 by 600? I'm bored with having to do a small design and I see loads of white space on the side. Back in those days, we had those discussions. We'll see in a minute. We haven't gone away from that because now it's coming back to bite us in the bottom. But we had those discussions, even in those days, about when can I do things and my audience will have the newest technology to actually use it. And we devised, again, back in those days, it took a while, but we devised strategies how to deal with the variability of the web. The fact that we can't control that all our users are using 640 by 480 or 800 by 600 monitors, or web-safe colors versus millions of colors. Who have the pain of going through images and saying, oh, I need to use web-safe colors, or even, I don't know, black and white, green screens. That's going back quite a while. But we devised strategies to deal with that. So big debates, fluid designs versus fixed designs. There's also elastic designs. But basically designers started to think about, okay, we'll accept that we can't control these things. Let's build coding strategies to actually move beyond that. As I was doing a little bit of research for this, I actually found old articles that advocated you should build 2 web pages, one version of your website for 640 by 480 and one for 800 by 600. That sounds familiar to some of the current thinking about you need a mobile website, you need a desktop website. So again, I would argue that these are the same kind of discussions that we're always having. The Tao of web design back in 2000, John Alsop, still rings true today. The sage accepts the ebb and flow of things. Basically, you can't control how your users are seeing your content. Just deal with it. It's the nature of the technology. You can't control it. But there are coping strategies like fluid layout, elastic layouts, etc., that we've developed over the years to help us with that particular problem. And then there's big debates, or back then, the big debates about web pages. Yeah, web pages are very static things. We started building web pages because here's loads of content, we need to put it up, we need to put a few nice pictures on it. But more and more web designers wanted to do more than just static designs. We've got the web, it's almost like TV. They wanted to replicate some of the stuff that they saw in other media, and they wanted to really build a web experience rather than just a static web page. We had computer games like CD-ROM games back in those days that were all whiz-bang, super interactive. How can we bring that to the web as well? We don't just want to do really static, flat, boring pages. Animated GIFs, wonderful. Actually, I saw some old websites that advertise, this is using GIF 89A animation. Again, we chuckle at this now, all the spinning ad signs with email, everything else, great under construction. All of that, but it shows a desire, again, in my mind, designers want to break out of the static, flat, web page world, and they want to introduce the dynamic aspects to it. How they went about it, they used the limited technologies available at the time. Java applets. I remember when I first saw Java applets, I thought, that's the shit. You really, in a good way, I can make things, like the ripple effects on your images and stuff like that. And strangely enough, we're seeing those coming back now. It's Canvas now, and it's cool. But back in those days, yeah, Java, what's his name? Duke for Java. Wonderful stuff. Again, we chuckle at this stuff. Future Splash. Who remembers Future Splash? Which then turned into Adobe Flash. Well, Macromedia Flash and then Adobe Flash. Version 1 of Future Splash. I remember when I saw that. Again, a game changer. I can now have a web page which is mainly static. I can have things moving around, animating them, and everything else. How cool is that? And I'm going to tempt the demo gods and actually jump to the browser. For those who haven't seen it, anybody remember Too Advanced?
I love it.
It's great stuff. So as an example of, we're not building web pages, we're building web experiences. This is the sort of stuff that I remember seeing back in those days. And hopefully the sound is not too loud, if it is actually on. No? Do it for me. To somebody who designed static, flat pages, maybe an animated GIF, you see this sort of stuff. Cinematic quality to it. And the whole kind of, we now have web pages that have like a 15-minute intro that we have to skip. Because it's like, it's almost like turning on the TV. And yeah, look, if you move around here, it actually has loads of transition effects and things move, and it's all, it's not reloading a separate page, it's all building it inside the page, all self-contained experience, like we experience from things like the CD-ROM games and everything else. This was cool stuff. I'm going to stop the music because it's very annoying. But you can't argue that, this pushed the web forward at the time. Again, it looks very dated now. We look at this and think, that's so cyberpunk, early 2000s. But at the time, this was the cutting edge stuff, and it pushed the web into a completely different direction. You know, compare this stuff to what you could do, even with a few animated GIFs, and maybe a bit of JavaScript. You couldn't match this level of interactivity. Things like, okay, you could start putting things into frames or iframes, or use things like Ajax when it started to become supported in all browsers, to kind of imitate this idea. All these technologies started to fill that gap of, we want to build web pages that are more than just web pages, build web experiences. And yes, this was completely done in Flash. The entire web page is basically just a big container for Flash. Now we know Flash is evil and everything else. Although it was good at the time, it pushed the web forward. It was content delivered over the web, but it wasn't content off the web, if that makes sense. But it really showed us a direction that designers and developers wanted to take the web. And hopefully I'll be able to jump back into my presentation without it crashing. Yes, wonderful. Having a good technology day. So, obviously with more and more stuff in Flash itself, or any kind of plugin based content, is obviously a black box. It's compiled together kind of stuff. It's not, as I said, content off the web. And the beauty of the web, for me, has always been that it's a cool page, technology. You can just view source, and if you're clever enough, you can start to dissect it and learn from it. That's how I started to learn about good web design and good web technology practices by just looking at what other people did. This whole thing with Flash plugin-based stuff, Java applets, and everything else, it did take the web into a slightly darker direction because everything was just black boxes. But we're now coming through that on the other side. You could argue that it was problematic at the time because everything started to become just basically Flash. But we've come through, we've surmounted that, and now the technology is kind of giving us the opportunity to do this sort of stuff, these interactive experiences, even using web technologies. So after pushing us in that direction, Flash can now gracefully fade into the background. And again, same discussions, yes, we're using the web, great, but we're now just putting all these black boxes in there.
Kierowca samochodu Renault Traffic parkującego przy Powtarzam, kierowca samochodu Renault Traffic parkującego przy hotelu, proszę mnie natychmiastowe przeparkowanie samochodu.
So you could argue that yes, it was on the web, but it brought with it, yet again, accessibility concerns. And every time these new technologies come along, people start to get excited about it and use them. The technologies themselves aren't quite ready yet in terms of accessibility, for instance, and that's a biggie. They slowly develop and get better. Flash, the very early versions of Flash, it was a complete black box to, say, somebody with a screen reader, somebody who needed accessibility support. They couldn't do anything with it. And Adobe, Macromedia to start with, and then Adobe really developed the format further, the black box itself. They made the black box more porous, that you could actually have screen readers get information in and out of that. So slowly the technology adapts, but as it's first implemented, it has issues like accessibility. It's nothing new. And we always want to take our technologies further. If you're using a lot of JavaScript in your pages, you'll know that JavaScript itself, as good as it is, there are many things that up to now you couldn't really do with JavaScript. So what did you do? You started to patch things up. You started to enhance it by adding stuff on top of it. jQuery, I'm not going to argue, jQuery, tools, whatever your poison, any kind of framework, JavaScript framework that you might be using today in your project is really there because plain JavaScript, as powerful as it is also very limited, especially when you want to do things that work across different browsers, because browsers haven't implemented everything the same way, and because there are simply things that don't exist in native JavaScript. up to now things like, I don't know, using CSS selectors to actually select elements in your pages. That was not a native capability, that was present in JavaScript. So frameworks like jQuery basically added that on top of it, and it was a good thing. And we saw that now these things are being specced out in JavaScript itself with HTML5. You do get things like being able to use CSS selectors in JavaScript natively without using big tools like that. But at the time, developers and designers want to do something and they'll find ways to do it. You could argue it's a gigantic and brilliant hack, jQuery and frameworks of a similar kind, but they fulfilled a need. And that's what designers did. They found their own uses for these things. Same thing on the CSS side. CSS itself, I don't know for how many years people have talked about, we need more capabilities in our CSS. We need things like variables. You know, how simple is that? And that's been the request for the last, I think, 10, 15 years from web developers and designers. We need these kind of capabilities of writing less CSS, writing more clever CSS. And you know, while this is now being looked at and the spec is being worked on, browsers will start to support it. The technology is evolving in that direction finally. In the meantime, developers kind of came up with their own ways of dealing with it. You know, pre-compilers for things like CSS. You know, Sass, I've not personally used it. I hear lots of good things about it. I'm not clever enough to use it. But these are the sorts of things developers find their own ways. You might again argue that it's slightly of an abuse using pre-compilers, and kind of it turns the whole build process of how we used to do pages. It's now everything needs to be kind of pre-compiled and then minified and everything else. It's not kind of the easy web that I remember when I used to hack away. But you know, the need is there, and developers have found ways around the limitations of technologies. And again, that's kind of a common theme. Designers want something, the technology doesn't allow it, they'll find ways around the problem. Maybe perverting some of the things, maybe abusing some technologies, but they'll find it, and then the technology in the end catches up with those particular needs that they have. But there is always a transitional period. And now, obviously, we're here, HTML5, or HTML, the living standard, as it's going to be, as modeled by Bruce on his t-shirt. It is the future, it's great. And I'm going to use HTML5 in the way that I hate, which is, it's kind of HTML5, just take it as all the cool new stuff. So, you know, I'm going to lump CSS in there, you know, CSS3 stuff that's coming. Loads of other technologies that have got nothing to do with anything kind of HTML or CSS, but they're there. Basically, the cool stuff with HTML5 that you'll probably hear over and over again in the next 2 days, and wherever you look in the kind of the press, the tech press and everything, everybody's hot on HTML5 because it's bringing a lot of new capabilities, a lot of new shiny tools that us designers and developers have been wanting for such a long time, and we can now do them. Finally, the technology is catching up with us. And particularly for the HTML5 kind of markup idea, how it's actually being built, but I'm going to extend that to also encompass how CSS standards are being built. It's about paving the cowpaths. It's about looking at what are designers and developers wanting to do with tools like jQuery and Sass, and I don't know, abusing plugin-based technologies to do things like web experiences with Flash and that sort of stuff, using images to actually enshrine text because they want a particular font and everything else. So it's looking at what designers are trying to do and then bringing it into the specification itself, and as such bringing it as a native technology inside the browsers. But obviously, if we're talking about paving the cowpaths, there need to be cows there to start us there. I'm getting very philosophical. It's basically, specification work is, in many cases, retrospective. It's looking at what designers have been trying to do, and then trying from there to spec it out. And then once it's stable, it will be released and it will be usable. Yes, to a certain extent with things like HTML5 and rapid release cycles of browsers, it's not a 10-year waiting before you can start to use things, but it's a transitional period before you can say all my users are using the latest version of the browser. In some cases they can't. How do we deal with that? So spec work is most of the time retrospective. It looks at what are the current practices, what are the past practices. It doesn't, nobody hopefully goes into the spec things except for you from Google and say, here's a cool new thing, let's implement this. You know, designers will love it. It looks backwards, it looks at what are the needs, what are the use cases, and then tries to specify it. And now, yes, finally, the technology is caught up. So now we can do rounded corners in CSS. Wonderful. Just now that people are, well, designers are now saying that's so retro. I don't need my rounded corners anymore. But we now have the ability, if we want to do a site, you know, we don't have to mess about with, we need 4 containers and we position image elements. Finally, the specification is caught up with what designers wanted to do 10 years ago. Same thing for like drop shadows or box shadows, that sort of stuff. Although they're making a return now, but these are all the things that back in the days it took us forever to try and work out. And in terms of layout, we're getting cool new stuff. Here's just one example. I gather we'll hear a few more examples in the next 2 days. But being able to do multi-column layouts without having to chop up our content, without having to create, I don't know, a table or floating 5 or 6 different divs against each other that one could fall under and everything else. We now have more robust ways in things like CSS to actually build more complex layout. And that's a good thing. It took a long time, but we're now slowly getting tools. And there's lots more, you know, it's not just multi-column, there's specifications like Flexbox that make, especially for UI kind of elements, it lets you really build things, really clever designs. And there's even more stuff coming down the pipeline now. I've seen adding things like SVG filters to pages. All of these abilities that we wanted to do for ages are now slowly being specified, and they're slowly finding their way into browsers, which is a good thing. From the typography side of things, yes, you know, it has been a while since we've had to use things like one big image map with loads of clickable areas. We have learned, but there have been techniques over the years, again from the golden days of messing around with CSS. Who remembers all the various kind of image replacement techniques? Every designer, I think at the time it was cool to actually invent one just so you have your name somewhere. The Farner image replacement, and you know, the Sean Inman flash replacement, which then took it one step further, adding flash to it, or coupon, or however you pronounce it. All of these things, again, we laugh at them now, what an abuse of technology, you know, going via flash to do like just a bit of font. It's still better than doing images, more flexible. But we now moved on from that, and now we can finally do things like actually using nice fonts in our pages. Yes, there are still loads of teething problems here and there, but the tools are now growing up. Basically now, if we want to do something clever or something that looks nice, the tools are now there to do that without having to worry too much how we do it, without having to look for technologies like Cipher, like Kufon and everything else. So the tools are growing up. They're giving us more ways to do stuff. So here's Lost Worlds Fair, nice example from Microsoft that actually shows, I'm going to show that, why not, I've got time. That actually shows us what can be done with the power of
font space.
Embedding font.
So I'll just pick one. So again, you can now start to do things, you know, without having to worry too much about how I'm going to slice this up, how I'm going to put it in a table, which is a big image map. You know, all the text is selectable. It's just using very nice typefaces. And yes, well, the font issue has been a long-standing one. IE4 invented, as far as I know, the whole concept of sending font files over the wire so you can actually embed font with the EOT format. I thought it was innovative back in those days. Credit goes to, we now have, obviously with fonts, there's loads of issues with the foundries not wanting to send their fonts because they're loads of money. But we kind of worked through that, and now it's possible, if I want to use nice typography on my site, to actually do that.
So again, the tools have caught up with the desire that we as designers and developers have had all along. And obviously, using that is a million times more accessible than dropping everything into a big image. So these issues of accessibility as well, and how does it adapt in different browsers, are being worked on. As the technologies mature, the solutions mature with them. But some discussions keep coming back. Now we're all cool and we're not 800 or 600 anymore. Now we're the designers with a big HD monitor in front of us. And we're seeing not issues anymore about when can I stop designing for 640 by 480. That's long gone. All those issues. Now everybody has big monitors, and then you start to get a complete opposite. After we thought finally we can stop worrying about the really small screens, yay! Now we're back to square one with smaller and smaller handheld devices, tablets, and everything else. But some of the technologies that we've had to kind of dream up when we had the old discussion about 800 by 600 and everything else, fluid, thick versus fixed, elastic layouts and everything else, are now, interesting enough, making a comeback. And what we've learned from those days, hopefully, can now be applied today as well. So things like, responsive web design, Ethan Marcotti's seminal, you have to say seminal every time you mention this article, seminal article, basically it just takes concepts. It's not that Ethan dreamed these things up all by himself. He's standing on the shoulders of giants. He is taking all the good bits of web development best practice that we've had for years and synthesized them, added a few extra things, and showed how all these old technologies that we had to devise because we couldn't control how users see our content are now even more relevant when we start to talk about different devices, different screen sizes, and everything else. So the poster child at the moment, don't know if you've seen it, the Boston Globe redesign, responsive web design in that, depending on what screen size you have, it doesn't just shrink down in terms of, the text gets smaller and smaller, but it actually, at certain points, adapts itself to the device that you're looking at it. Again, fundamentally, stuff behind the scenes, it's media queries and things like fluid layouts and everything else, but combined in really clever new ways to actually address a very modern problem. Old solutions are coming back for modern problems. Because the technology is now more mature, we can actually use them in a slightly better way with media queries behind it. But again, this is a theme. Don't throw away everything you've learned from the past, because some of these things always seem to come back in better ways as the technology progresses. And again, things like web page versus web experience. We've seen the too advanced, too cool things that you could do with pages zipping around and flashing and opening. I'm going to show something that now is quite easily possible with, if I can find it, where did I open it? It's now possible to do purely using web technology. So we're talking about we need our pages to be, more experiences rather than flat pages. They even have the kind of intro coming up, so they're really going old school with it. But there's no flash. No flash was harmed with this. It stutters a little bit. They have the skip link as well. Yeah, it stutters very badly. So again, those debates we used to have about when are people all going to be on broadband so I can send them gigantic video files down the wire. Maybe they need to start revisiting those. I'll skip that. But it has all the the trappings of the old flash-based kind of experience sites. What was it? Bruce, PlayStation. Yeah, it's like PlayStation all over again. All of those things, you know. They even make the little annoying clicky sound as it links. You know, it's like it's Flash, but it's not. I can't believe it's not Flash. It should be called. You know, great big experience. But obviously, again, we can laugh at this. But it shows that there's always been a need for this, but now it's built with obviously the cool new stuff, HTML5, so it's a lot better. It is, because as I said, we're now using, it's not a black box. I can view source, I can start to kind of understand how these things work. In terms of accessibility, this can be made a lot more accessible than Flash, although as I said, with Flash over the years, if you know what you're doing, you can actually build accessible Flash, but this is already being given the accessibility stuff out of the box because it's built on web technologies with HTML and everything else. Obviously you need to know how to do it properly, but it's one step less to worry about when you're deploying content to the web. Obviously now we're also getting games, you know, in browsers, now that we have tools like Canvas where we can start to throw pixels at the screen and everything else. And games is probably the latest, the new frontier of, you know, it's very complex to do, it's very processor intensive and everything else, but you know, it looks fantastic and you can just open up a web browser and there's games happening there on the screen. And again, I built a few of these things myself with my very limited knowledge. I did kind of an Arkanoid type clone game. You know, it's fun to do. It's not perfect, but it's not the be all and end all. I see some of my old Flash developer friends who kind of look at that and go, great, you can now do what I used to do about 15 years ago. And it's true. Again, this is not new. It's like, just because we have Canvas, we had retro games or games in web pages for ages. It's just now we have the technologies are more mature and we can do them without going via black boxes like Flash. But it always goes in circles. As I said, we used to have these retro things back 15 years ago. They're making a comeback because the technology allows us to. More advanced games, it's not all retro games. I'm not going to demo this because I'm running slightly out of time. But WebGL is now the next cool thing. Every time you think, oh, those tools we want, developers want more. So we now got WebGL, accelerated graphics in hardware acceleration in the browsers themselves, which can be used for 2D games. It's great stuff. But now, whenever we talk about WebGL, it's this sort of thing that we're thinking of. And it is surprising to me and scary that we can now do these sorts of things purely with web technologies. You know, we have this Opera Next, which now has WebGL support. It takes forever to load all the textures, but this is not a pre-rendered thing. I can actually now drive around with this car. Fantastic. But the camera keeps switching, so I actually start getting a bit seasick after a while. But the idea that I could view source, it's complete gibberish because WebGL is almost a meta language on top of my web page because I'm talking directly to the graphics card. But behind the scenes, really, I'm not using a plugin, it's the browser doing it. If I know enough about it, I can actually go in, modify things, change things. And again, it's not new 3D graphics in web pages, we've seen that before. But the fact that we now have the technology available directly in the browser, that's the new cool thing. And I hope that nobody's now planning to rebuild all their web pages doing like pure 3D graphics, because we know how Second Life was so successful in doing that sort of stuff. But again, the tools are there, and it's not just frivolous stuff like this. I mean, this is a nice tech demo. There are, and I'm going to open it in another browser because they do some crazy ass browser sniffing, so it doesn't load. But things like that, Google actually had a nice Google body thing, but they just closed Google Labs recently, so that URL broke for everybody. So I found an equivalent. Again, this is not just cool demo as a car running around. You can actually start to use these techniques, these technologies,
to do something valuable. Things like, I don't know, exploring the human body, turning things on and off, zooming in. Again, this was possible before, and there were probably websites doing this sort of stuff before using Flash or whatever. It's just cool now that we can do that with current technologies inside the web itself. Back to the proposal. And also, I'm not going to play this because I'm running out of time, but feel free to have a look at it. You get WebGL kind of music videos now. It's almost a new cool thing that you can do. Things that animate to the music, you fly around in them, 3D virtual environments and everything else. Cool stuff. Again, accessibility. Now, how to make something like that body explorer accessible. I wouldn't even know where to start. So again, we have technologies that are now, there in the browser. It will take a while before we actually work out the techniques and technologies to make these things accessible. So that will be the next battle. I mean, that's the extreme case, but even just canvas, flat 2D games, how do we make those accessible? So again, we've got new technology, people start to use it. It's not perfected, it's not perfect in terms of accessibility. Over the years, we'll find solutions to those problems, but at the moment, it's not the perfect solution if you need to do accessible stuff. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it, just use it responsibly. And again, with all the new stuff that we got in CSS and HTML, of course we see people taking that, saying, okay, that's great, I now have all these tools, I want to do more. And there will always be people who take technologies, even the latest technologies, and think, this doesn't address my particular use case, and they'll use it and they'll bend it to their particular will. Mad animation, any of you seen that? Yeah? Well, I'm going to bore you by playing it again. So, great stuff, using CSS animations that we can now do. Looks really cool. It doesn't use Flash, so it must be cool. It's HTML5, so it must be cool. Great stuff, and lots of creativity behind it. There's actually a tool, a web-based tool behind it that lets you build these things in a reasonably easy way. There's your friend, Jake. Great stuff. I'm not going to bore you with the entirety of it, but this is what it looks like behind the scenes. This is some jQuery. What's it actually doing? If you start to view source, it's just regurgitating loads and loads and loads and loads of divs with images, and no alt on the images either. But I don't think that's the least of their worries. With hundreds and hundreds of IDs, and then it has, yes, it uses CSS to animate this, but is this the right use for CSS animations? Just so you can have, again, meaningless divs and sounds and stuff, move them around the screen. I'd say that's abuse of technology. It's certainly cool, but it's not really the way it should be done. But nonetheless, designers are going to do that. As tools evolve, well, I would argue now that whole thing should have been wrapped as an SVG, because that's more of a native thing for it. But, the technology will evolve, the tools will be there, and designers will start to use the right tool for the job. But at the moment, they see a new shiny toy and they'll use it, they might abuse it. Or, we can now do gradients in CSS, linear gradients, radial gradients. That's not enough. There's really clever people like Leah LaRue who's got a CSS gradients gallery where she's almost abusing the gradients technology to do patterns. It's nowhere in the spec itself that if you use this way, you can do hearts as your background. But people do use it. Unforeseen use of technology. And we'll always see that. Every time we think the specification's finished and we've got all the tools we need, somebody says, yeah, but it doesn't address this particular need I have. And they'll find a way to do it. The street will find a way. Designers want, technology allows the tension between them. And we see all the discussions again, it's not web page versus web experience, now it's web page versus web app. Is this the web? Is this the future web we just use? Think back at the Flash experiences where the page was just a container for a Flash movie, and now get to the stage where there is actually no page. It's all purely cool JavaScript, and we're injecting everything into a blank document.
is this the web? I don't know. I would argue that there's a bit of abuse going on here. But, other people will argue against it and say, oh, it's a web app. That's completely different from a web page. We'll see. Same discussion we had about it's a web experience or a web page. Web app versus native app. Why do I want to do a web app? I need a native app. Why not combine these things? And slowly, the lines between native and web are blurring. Widgets, things like phone gap, let you build using web standards and actually then deploy as a native app. WebOS, we've seen how popular that was. The devices. The browser is becoming more and more of a platform, really. So as we've seen, the technology is maturing. I'm wrapping up now. The technology is maturing. The tools are there. The tools are not always there when we need them, and we have to, as designers and developers, build around them, find our own uses, hack away at things, abuse things sometimes. But, as time progresses, the technology catches up, the standards catch up, and they give us what we need. But we'll always be looking for the next shiny thing. Gratuitous demo here. We can now do things like direct camera access, from a web browser to this one crash. So, in a web page, we can now access the camera itself, and via canvas and all the cool new shit, we can manipulate it. Beautiful. So, again, the lines are blurring between what is a web page and, what can I do, what can I access directly on my machine. You can read files with the file API, drag and drop is coming as well to all browsers, you can drag things, you can build native things. Again, but that will never be enough. Designers will always want to do more. Recently, I just saw this tweet coming here. I'll only build web pages from now on for the latest version of web browsers. I would argue that is a bit of a stretch. Yes, we all want to use the latest cool new stuff. And I understand it. I want to do that myself. I want to build a web page. I want to come up with an idea so I can use this camera thing. It's a gimmick. I want to use it. I want to use animations. I want to do all the shiny new stuff. I want to do it now. And I'm really annoyed that people aren't upgrading their 640x480 monitors to see my beautiful designs. But I think throwing out years of best practices of building web pages that adapt and web pages that don't fight the nature of the web, of being very fluid and you can't control it, and just saying, I'm just going to use the shiny now because I want to, and everybody should just use the latest version of the browser. It's a bit short-sighted. The web is in constant beta, so there's always change. The standards are never finished, and designers will always try to push the envelope anyway. Even if the standard was perfect today, tomorrow there'll be people saying, it doesn't do this. Again, accept the ebb and flow. We're going back full circle with these. Yes, browsers, not all browsers update early enough for some people. Everybody wants, when's feature X going to be supported in Opera? Or when's feature Y coming to Chrome? And when's the next nightly? Normal people don't use the web that way. My mom doesn't worry about, I need to have the absolute latest geo-enabled build on my machine. So, again, don't throw out years of best practice of progressive enhancement, graceful degradation, all of that. It's an evolution, not a revolution. We can't, by fiat, say tomorrow everybody will have to upgrade their browser. And we have to live with that. That's part of what makes the web exciting. And all these techniques, all these discussions that we have, is it a web page, is it a web app, is it a web experience, 800 by 600, 1000, whatever, they're all coming back. Just learn from the past, don't throw everything out just because you've got new shiny toys. And remember that now are the good old days of tomorrow. So in 10 years' time we'll look back, remember when we could do multi-code or WebGL in the browser, how clunky was that? And with that, thank you very much.